One thing to keep in mind is that there's only so much we can do in a town hall meeting with this type of interest, and that we plan to expand this conversation to additional programming between Sacred Ground in Action and Simpler Living that will give parties perhaps the more opportunities to have more engagement. And frankly, we would like to have future programming in which representatives from the Kumeyaay Nation can also be here to share opinions, share in the conversation, and also, quite frankly, perhaps provide some additional guidance for us. But as I alluded to, there is a uniqueness, and maybe all of you are fully aware of this. I do not want to make any assumption that you have not tracked all this very well. But I think it's fair to say that as a nation, many of us have been indoctrinated with different views of Indigenous people, some of which has been less than complimentary, and certainly maybe even twisted in many ways with regards to whether parties have been erased from history or somehow excluded from history. And then the question of whose history. So we find ourselves at an interesting point now that we have access to so much great information. But I would offer that, and what hopefully you'll see during this particular town hall, we'd like to introduce the topic by actually hearing voices from the Kumeyaay about, there's actually a few, I guess we can call them documentaries that have been put together. Some of them you may be able to find on our Sacred Ground in Action Sacred Ground in Action website presence. And what I wanted to do is we actually plan to go through those later to have other events where we can have really an exchange and a back and forth about what's being communicated in those particular videos. But for the sake of this particular presentation, I wanted to just grab a few pieces to kind of get us launched. So there is the video, which is My Culture, My History, My Land. This was created roughly about 5 years ago by the Kumeyaay Nation as, I guess, the major producer. It has a combination of many different voices in it. And it actually takes parties through different stages, stages that are like from the beginning, maybe a sense of looking at what the legacy has been for people who have been here 12,000 plus years. It goes into pre-contact with with Western world and other parties who are coming across the land. And also then to a section called Contact, which actually we're going to probably focus mostly on that here. And then it will probably end, as you could probably tell, I'm skipping in bits and pieces of this particular documentary. So we'll end with two things that kind of bring us to the present. But with each different segment, let's say, for example, pre-contact and then contact, we'll take a pause and if you will, maybe we have a chance to just go through a few questions collectively to see what your thoughts might be, whether it jives with the history or the knowledge you already thought you had regarding the Indigenous population that's right here.
Robbie,
Please.
And not to be, this is not at all critical, but we've learned in the past few months that words, well, we already know that words have meaning. But it is the Sequan band of the Kumeyaay Nation. And those distinctions are pretty important to the people. So I apologize for that mild correction, but yeah, just to point out that it is the Sequan band.
Correct. And actually in the video, you'll hear some other distinctions in terms of how groupings can be identified.
Sure.
Thanks, Diane.
Sure.
So what I'd like to do, if you bear with me, I'm going to see if I can share my screen. And we'll start off with one video that should run roughly only two minutes and about 10 seconds. We'll have a conversation, and then followed by a longer video that roughly runs for about 7 minutes and 30 seconds. So let's see if we can share a screen. Can you see this at the moment?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. Let me know if you can hear it. I'll look at you, Diane. Give me an okay if you can hear it, okay?
Okay, will do.
Well, the
We can hear it, yes.
life prior to the first invasion by the Europeans was a way of life of a free and independent existence. And primarily the people lived in small villages or in family areas, and primarily around areas of water, because that's where the animals gather, and that's essential for life. Water is life, and the Kumeyaay people certainly understood that.
A typical Kumeyaay village, unlike the Hollywood Village is it's a bunch of teepees put close together so the camera can pan back and forth. This village, Pamu, would have encompassed roughly a square mile of habitation, of stone tool making, of pottery, but it would have even been larger than that if you think about the suburbs versus the shopping center versus the manufacturing plant versus the hospital. All of that would have been even larger than this. Probably would have supported 200 to 300 people. It was occupied by 5 different clans.
The basic organizational structure of the Kumeyaay was centered around the Shemuk. We commonly use the word clan nowadays because people, especially non-Indians, are more familiar with the term clan, and so we talk about our clans, and different clans had different names. Mine was Misquish, that I'm from, and the clans had alliances or relationships with other clans. We would seasonally move through our territory, move from the warmer months, from the mountain areas, and then go down the drainages to the lower elevations in the desert and the coast during the winter months. And then there were some villages that stayed in those low elevations all year round too. So through a complex system of linkages and affiliations between the clans, between Shemuks, we would come together, and there was exchange that occurred between people, and there were exchanges that occurred between tribes.
Okay, that was just pretty much just a short, and it's probably highly inefficient from my standpoint, because I'm only giving you just a snippet of what really is a really good documentary that leads up to that point. But well, a few things that we thought would be of interest, at least for our first conversation, is whether people's perceptions of folks who have been here 12,000 years plus, whether this is the same image you have so far of what the history has been for the Kumeyaay, and whether or not did you actually also get the sense that for those who are here in this area, quite frankly, that that their sense of organization, a sense of moving across different parts of boundaries, is something that has been time honored for so many years that it actually kind of sets the stage for what happens once that's pre-contact. But when you understand as we all understand what happens with contact, what has changed. But anything from those comments or images, or even the organization of how Kumeyaay are organized, is any of that something that you normally have heard before, prior to now? Or have you actually heard from Kumeyaay before about their organization?
Yeah, I have heard that they would migrate between villages or settlements on the coast and in the mountains, depending on the time of year. So that was something I understood to be true.
And thank you. And I guess part of what before we move to this next segment, I also just wanted to get a sense whether, never to make an assumption, but to kind of get a little bit of a sense of a baseline of not only who we are, but actually what our perceptions of pre-contact Kumeyaay might have been. And hopefully this gives just a little bit of some insight to it. Let me move to the next one, and this will take a second because I need to fast forward the video without starting it. So bear with me again, please. Okay, I think we're ready. Okay, hopefully you can see that. Yes. Okay, thank you.
The story about initial invasion. And it's important to understand that the Christian Europeans who came by ship and overland to the Americas actually had an ideology that they carried with them. They didn't simply bring various forms of technology on their ships, but they also carried a way of thinking. And that way of thinking had to do with a right, a divine right in their view, to go forth to lands that had not yet been discovered by Christians and to place those lands under a form of Christian dominion, or as I refer to it as Christian domination.
For the Spanish, they knew that there was no way they can control San Diego. A big myth is that when the missions came here to San Diego, that the Kumeyaay were so thankful and that they had been so behind the world in culture and education that these Spanish people somehow came here and liberated them. And the truth is that this Kumeyaay people had a culture that was thousands of years old. They already had government systems that were in place that they were able to live peaceful existences. They had a culture that they respected and they enjoyed, a way of life and a means of living in this land that they were succeeding, they were thriving.
And I still hear people talk about the Spaniards building the missions. No Spaniard ever made an adobe block that I know of. They were all made by the Kumeyaay. No Spaniard built Padre Dam in Mission Trails Regional Park. That was built by Kumeyaay people. The trails that every explorer followed, all those great intrepid explorers, they always had an Indian in front of them, or they were already on an Indian trail. So the only people who were lost were the Europeans. The Indians were never lost. So I don't know how one could say they discovered San Diego.
California history didn't start with the missions, and Indian history didn't end with the missions. But that's the impression you get when you look at the way history has been taught in California in the school system. Of course, when they have the missions, they have to have somebody to be missionaries too, so it's almost like they're forced to acknowledge the fact that there were Indians that lived here.
If the history, the human history of San Diego County is 1 hour, the Europeans have been here half a minute. So we have been here half a minute. All the rest of that was Native American. And yet when you pick up a textbook, when you hear a lecture somewhere, it's always about those later people. It's about us. It's about the Spaniards. It's about the Mexicans. It's about mission-style architecture, Balboa Park. And so when you look at it in the time frame of minutes to years, we haven't been here a great deal.
The reaction of the Kumeyaay people to this onslaught of the mission system throughout California, but specifically in the Kumeyaay territory, was well illustrated by the burning of the San Diego Mission de Ocala by the Kumeyaay people in 1775. And in November of that year, numerous bands of the Kumeyaay Nation came together and burned the mission to the ground, and the priest was killed. That was a very strong statement as to how the Kumeyaay felt about the tremendous loss of life. There was a very high death rate among the people in the mission systems. I believe that the statistic was that your lifespan was about 6 years once you entered into that mission system.
I think one of the reasons the Kumeyaay have done so well as a culture is when the Spaniards came in, they adapted. They said, okay, you're going to make us grow some corns and beans and things that we didn't traditionally grow here, some wheats and barleys. We'll learn how to do that, and if we like that food, we'll introduce it into our own. So in 1777, when a Spanish group came through here on the way to Julian, these people here were growing wheat. There was no wheat being grown at the Mission San Diego. They got that wheat from some other mission and brought it here and planted it. And the Spaniards are going, why is there wheat growing here? And someone said, it must not be real wheat. It was real wheat.
People are always amazed when I tell them that The Spanish only controlled a tiny strip of the coast. Most of California was under the control of Indian people all throughout the Spanish period. And during that time, there was constant warfare that was occurring with the free Indian people. And they were launching attacks. In some cases, hundreds of warriors would join in on attacks against the Spanish. So it was never the case that they really controlled more than that strip. Now, they had the technology with their leather armor, metal helmets, and their firearms. They had the capability of extending their power anywhere they wanted. So they could take a patrol and they could go through any of our territory, but they never controlled it. As soon as they left, it was back under our control.
We know a great deal about this village because it shows up in mission records. And while it had been here for thousands of years, in 1778 it was actually attacked by people from the Presidio of San Diego, by Spaniards, because the Native Americans of Pamu, the Ipai, refused to come in and be missionized.
When the missions tried to improve their situation, the way they did that was not by sending in a military force. They didn't do that by going in and taking all the Kumeyaay bands down at once. That was an impossibility. Instead, they would go group by group. They would go village by village, and if they could find a small village, they would take that village, and they would take the kids if they were able to. They would take the people they saw as leaders if they were able to, and they would take over that village. Most of the Kumeyaay people understood this, and they retreated back to larger villages in their area.
It speaks to that very real interaction between the Spaniards and the Kumeyaay people on this site. They finally abandoned the site about 1810, it looks like, because the Spaniards were coming up here doing more cattle grazing and setting up some haciendas nearby. So the people of this village, as was the case with many villages in San Diego, went further back into the interior. So when it comes time to set up the reservations, that's where they are today. And I think one of the misconceptions many people have is, why didn't they live on the coast? Well, they did, but they were shoved off the coast.
The next major event in terms of the overall chronology would probably be the Mexican Revolution, the bid for Mexico to win its independence from Spain. That began in 1810, and that culminated in 1824 with the establishment of the first Mexican Constitution, and as it was called, the Mexican Empire. Under the Mexican system, there was a secularization of the missions, in other words, a disbanding of the mission system. But also under the Mexican system, you had a tremendous number of Mexican land grants of the Kumeyaay territory, and that resulted in thousands of acres of the prime real estate within the Kumeyaay territory being granted to very influential Mexican people.
This caused a lot of concern for the Indian people who had lived in the Mexican system and were part of it. And a lot of them chose to rebel. And they joined forces with the free Kumeyaay, who still controlled the majority of their territory. And these attacks became more and more effective from the 1830s to the 1840s. We like to sometimes refer to those as the Zorro years. This was a period of uprisings when the ranchos started falling all over the place. They were being abandoned, and the raids were becoming more and more effective. And by the 1840s, we were launching attacks directly on the city of San Diego itself.
And sorry, that's quite a stretch there, but I hope you could hear that, and hopefully it played fairly well being zoomed out. But as you can tell, we covered a bit of ground there, at least in terms of, I'll just say for myself, there's facets of this that I actually, and I thought I was somewhat well-versed on it, and realized how little I actually knew about some of the real details. But there's a lot to unpack there. Among the things was some notions that the Spaniards had controlled all of this area. In fact, that as the Kumeyaay was either moved off to some degree, but in fact that primarily they controlled the coastline. And there were some further inroads later into different other, as parties moved further east, different smaller air groups or tribes were being assaulted and taken over, but one by one, not as a full-on assault against all the Kumeyaay. And that one thing that perhaps, and maybe it strikes me, but that that this was not as parties basically invaded their land, that it wasn't a passive surrender, but indeed, definitely as times got even more dicey, parties fought back in different ways. Among the things I would love to ask you about your take on or your thoughts on regarding it, even the issue of the burning of the missions. Was that pretty much commonly known for those who were raised here in this region? Is it something that was fairly presented fairly in your, let's say in high school and the like, when you were going through some studies?
Well, elementary school was rather romantic, and the missions were the center of that romanticism. The Indians would cooperate and were enriched peacefully. That was what we were taught.
And I thank you, Richard. It also strikes me that the perception that the Indigenous folks who are here had to be contained and brought into the missionary life to some degree, to be trained in the missions. And what I found particularly provocative was that not only wasn't really voluntary, but on top of that, that the outcomes were such that there was even a reduction of lifespan. The parties tended not to
6 years.
survive for a long time after going through that particular ordeal.
If I could share another perspective too, I think bringing what happened then to today, it seemed like so many assumptions were made. Oh, we're better than these people who we're going to take over. I think sometimes it's possible to even have good intentions and make assumptions that can be really damaging. One of the things that, and just to kind of put it into today's perspective, I guess, Simpler Living was thinking along with what we learned in Sacred Ground last year and the awareness of land acknowledgements. We thought, well, wouldn't it be good for our cathedral to have a land acknowledgement, to have a plaque that says this was the land of the Kumeyaay. But then we thought that might be an assumption, that people may not, the Kumeyaay people may not want to have a plaque. There may be a better way to relate, and that was one of the ways that we started talking about how do we do that, realizing that it's a really a long-term project. So the gift of today is that we're starting that project, I guess, or at least making a little bit more known. And I appreciate that. So just wanted to share that.
And thank you, Joan. The other part, if I may piggyback on your comment, is that we all, I guess the best way to say it is that perhaps the best way to form a relationship or to build or forge additional relationships with our neighbors is to actually hear from their own voices. And one reason why this particular document was picked is that it is produced by Kumeyaay voices, if you will. Its intent is to share perspective. And maybe that could be just at least a starting point for us to when we can gather together and cover these topics with everybody involved. But I think it is also still, for me, provocative and somewhat alarming to realize that the institutions that were brought to bear against the Kumeyaay included basically a form of slavery, as they alluded to the issue if you were considered the vagrant laws, if you were not necessarily can be vouched for by someone who is actually a European, as that you're employed by them, then people have a chance to basically grab you, commandeer you, put you in a forced labor for 6 years. And then if you, after your 6-year horror is over, if you still didn't have someone who claims you, they can just do the same thing over again, and it just goes on and on and on. And in essence, it is indeed a form of slavery.
This is Rowena. I'm with the La Jolla Quaker meeting. We've been working on these topics for 4 or 5 years now also. And I think one of the things that might be kind of overlooked just a little bit here is the notion that the Spaniards controlled the coast. But in the earliest piece of this, they talked about how with the seasonal migration, it was important for the people to get down to the coast to trade with people who were on the coast and also trading with other folks up and down the coast. It was important for them to have that migratory route. And by cutting off the coast, you have cut off a good deal of that migratory route. And therefore you are cutting into not only the cultural exchanges, but you're cutting into the food supplies as well.
Thank you.
It's a really good point.
So we have one additional segment, actually two, that goes in. You saw just a hint of it as I didn't stop the video soon enough. But another section is basically capturing that America moves west, and basically how it impacted Indigenous people, and specifically here the Kumeyaay. So I'll show that, and it's a little bit, well, it's roughly about 5 minutes and 40 seconds long. So please bear with me, and we'll bring that up right now.
The next phase after the Mexican period is the what's called the American period, which would be the Mexican-American War of 1846 and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848. At that point, everything is considered to be under American control.
There were huge amounts of gold that had been discovered. Within a matter of a few decades, there was more gold mined in California than had been mined in the rest of the world for a couple hundred years. So this was a massive amount of wealth that was coming out of the ground. If there was any question at all as to who really owned that gold, that would be a huge issue. And the best way to extinguish any kind of claims or any kind of doubt as to who owns it is to kill whoever might be someone who could make that claim. The Treaty of San Isabel was one of 18 treaties that were negotiated in California in the early 1850s. Our treaty was negotiated in 1852. All of the treaties together set aside about 7.5 million acres of land in California for Indian people. At that time, this was before the Civil War, and there was a lot of fear that California might decide to join with the secessionist states. There was a lot of southern migration into California, and when the California legislature and the California congressional delegation lobbied against the ratification of the treaties, the Senate caved in on it. But one of the problems they had was that Indians were still a sizable portion, if not the majority, of the population in the state. And so they didn't want to have mass uprisings throughout California. So one of the ways that they dealt with that was they voted down the treaties, but they kept that decision sealed. And they never told the Indian people that they didn't approve the treaties. Remember, a lot of these Indian people had occupations under the Mexican system. They had worked as vaqueros, they had worked as blacksmiths, they had worked, all these different trades. So many of them decided that, they were going to set up their own ranches, and they thought they had the protections of their treaty. So they built ranches, they fenced land, they put cattle out, they put horses out. And then a white settler would come in and file a homestead on it, and he'd have a ready-made ranch, and he'd just take the land. And if the Indian was lucky, the white owner might allow him to stay on the land and work as a ranch hand on the very ranch that he created and built. And Indian people were confused. They didn't know what was going on. They thought they had protections, and yet people were coming and filing homesteads on them. And it was during this time also that the state of California decided that the real solution was to get rid of the Indians entirely.
For the American period, their interactions with the Kumeyaay was to erase their culture, to take their land, and to try to take everything they could from these people for economic gain.
And the state of California sponsored programs to kill Indians. There were bounties that were placed on Indians. There were laws that were passed that allowed Indian children to be taken from their homes and adopted out. They went through an adoption process, but they weren't really treated as their children. They used them as slave labor in the household. Some of the villages, the men were killed and the women and girls were taken to the brothels. There were vagrancy laws that were passed in California, which if an Indian person was found who had no visible means of support, if you didn't have a white person who would say he's your boss, then you could be arrested as a vagrant. And the punishment for being a vagrant was 6 months labor. At the end of that time, if you didn't have someone who would say that you're working for them, you could be rearrested as a vagrant again for another 6 months. So it was a form of slave labor that was adopted in California.
According to Dr. Florence.
Sorry, folks, a little bit slow on the stop there, but hopefully that played all the way through on your end, pretty much. I hope so. So it's as America moves west, this part of the work, our people, our culture, our history. It's interesting to see that almost systemic efforts are in place to try to deny, in fact, to some cases, to attempt to erase the presence of the Kumeyaay. And I would imagine for any one of us who grew up in a television culture of watching Westerns and the like, it seemed like who are the good guys and bad guys might be a little bit twisted here, I would think. But for any of you who would like to just comment on this particular period, because it sort of sets the stage to some extent to where we are headed to next. But that particular stage of actually creating the land, deciding what land is set aside for the Kumeyaay, only later to reduce it over time, that commerce, economic interests, greed in terms of the gold rush, just had people literally taking over land and creating, I can't think of, there's so many insults, but the greatest insult is that you actually think you have a treaty with the United States, you have protections in which you can have your own land, and someone comes, puts in a Homestead Act, and then they make you work on your own land that is now their land. That's just, it's not the first time in history, but it's still egregious, but it has happened. But any thoughts about that period of time and whether or not it represents, does it jive with what we were indoctrinated with as we were growing up, with any of you? And it's fine. I mean, it's the one thing I would say that at a minimum, if it's old information, I think it bears repeating. If it's new information, it's good for us to be aware of this part of the history, and also to know perhaps to some degree why that we are at another crossroads of making sure that we are fully aware and respectful of our neighbors. And part of it is to know what parties have been through.
As someone who did not grow up in California, I really had no preconceptions about Kumeyaay history, but my children were all educated in San Diego from K through 12. And they like Richard, and they were, a generation or so past Richard, had this romanticized, everybody makes a mission, a model mission building in fourth grade kind of history. And I did not hear these stories from them. And believe me, they would have told me had they sensed any form of injustice. But it does jive with what I've, as I've become more aware of what's been going, what the history nationally or, on this continent has been with the treatment of the Indigenous. It certainly jives with that. It also happened in San Diego, in California, and the state, not only the federal government, but the state was complicit in the treatment. So I think this was very, very powerful to hear.
So I grew up in Northern California. We heard some about it, but it was more downplayed. It was more sort of along the lines of, well, the Europeans brought in illnesses and it just happened to kill off a lot of the Indians. And, we're sad about it, but they left all this land to us. And so there was a lot more emphasis on, Indians grinding acorns and how they lived here and so forth, rather than a lot of the transition between, when the indigenous peoples were living here and the Europeans coming in. I mean, there was some of that, but it was kind of underplayed a little bit.
A lot.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot. It wasn't completely erased. There was some acknowledgement, but then it was just, we're not going to talk a lot about this unpleasantness.
Yeah, I think glossing over is especially the period after the missions were built and the Indians, the populations receded. Lots of different stories about how that happened, not this story. But I grew up in Chula Vista, and I was in grade school in the early 60s. I don't remember learning about the missions in the context of the Indians being glad to be there. I'd always been taught that they were enslaved. But we did hear stories about how good things were done for them because they didn't have resources, but that the price they paid for that was enslavement. And so I never heard that they were particularly happy about that. The treaties, I had no idea that these treaties were gathered up and agreed upon and then completely disregarded by the government. I will say in high school, we were given an essay question the question was, if you were a leader of your Indian tribe and negotiating a contract with the United States government, and you were asked how they could trust you and your tribe to abide by the treaty, and we were supposed to have an essay question, an essay answer on that. And I basically wrote that I'm really sorry I didn't have much else to say other than my response would have been to the government, what can you do or say to me to show you would abide by the agreement? And so that memory came flooding back to me on this one. And I apologize for not turning it into an essay. I said it just so infuriated me. It was all I could say. And I got an A.
Uh-huh.
And also, and please tell me about, hopefully I'm not mispronouncing your name. Is it Rowena?
It's Rowena.
Rowena, I'm sorry. Rowena, thank you for putting in the chat a reference to another work that I think we should definitely, and you believe, we should take a look at. I think it makes perfect sense. American Genocide, that actually provided greater detail about the killing of Indian Americans, Indian people, in the state of California. And that's at Amazon. We'll take a look and see if we can secure a copy that we could present to a large audience as well.
It's also available on several other sites, but it is technically out of print. It was a Yale University Press item, and Yale no longer has copies of it, but there are copies readily available. It's one of the most distressing books you will ever read in your life, because the authors outline every time 4 or more Indian people were killed, absolutely every instance of it. And
Wow.
it was a lot. And the other thing that they point out in that book is that when the Americans come over and the California legislature says we're going to put a bounty on Indian heads, essentially, that if you were able to kill 2 Indians, you made more than you would have made in a month's work working on a ranch or working as a blacksmith or working for anybody else. And so there was a huge preference on the part of a lot of people to go out and grab anybody they thought looked vaguely Indian and kill them and present their bodies for the bounty money.
Thank you. Well, we can see that this is not necessarily there's another way to characterize it, another dark moment in our nation's history, but more than just a moment. And the implications go well beyond that over time. Any other thoughts or comments regarding the, if you will, past actual contact, but moving to the move west by forces and taking over more land, particularly here in this area?
We just finished. We had a 5-week study on the book "Braiding Sweetgrass," which talks about a Native American PhD botanist and sharing the values that they had as Native Americans versus the culture we have. But in the book, I was shocked to learn that George Washington actually okayed the killing of I think it's the Osage, Osage, in New York. And so even our presidents, and also Jackson, I can't think of his first name right now, said, it's okay to slaughter the Indians, which is pretty shocking. And lastly, the other day they had something on TV about epidemics, and they showed horrific pictures of Native Americans with smallpox. Oh my God, like every inch of the body and the face, the arms, everything, had the little bumps, and they died horrible deaths, having been given infected blankets. They wanted to kill them using smallpox. It was a horrible way to die. It was terrible. Shocking. I mean, none of us knew about it. We have the romanticized version of, and the movies about cowboys and Indians, and it's very shocking.
Well, thank you.
The indignities are continuing, with land being taken, questions for whatever, mining, fossil fuel, extraction.
Sure.
So these things are going on today. I think that's why it's even more important that we make sure we understand the history in order to do something now.
And in the interest of time, and thank you for that, let's move to the last very short video, which is from the same documentary, but this is the segment on survivors, kind of like a point toward the present and to the future. This will take just a second.
One time I was making a pot And I took real good care of it, and I fired it, and I broke it. It just broke in the fire. My mother-in-law looked, and I was getting ready to throw it away, and she told me, and Kumeyaay, no. She said, bring that. What we did was we ground it up, and we mixed it with new dirt, and we were able to make a pot, and it stayed. And now we're coming together, just like that broken pot. Can either be angry, at what happened in the past. But if I'm angry, I can't pay attention to what I'm doing now is helping to put these things back together. When we speak our language, when we pass these things on, the cultural things, the creation story, all these things, when we do our ceremonies, we're not victims. We are survivors.
I'm very optimistic about the future of Sycuan. I see it from just the youth, from the attitudes in people my age, my generation, and the pride in the elders' eyes that this circle will continue to move forward. There's a reference to, even with Sycuan's logo, that the circle was broken. The original Aboriginal circle, a way of life, was broken with the onset of European discovery. There's this saying that our circle will never be complete, and we're always striving to complete that circle. We'll look back in the history of Sycuan. Indian gaming will just be one of many chapters in our history, but it will not be the story. It might be a very, very celebrated time because it has definitely been an economic turning point for the tribe. But as we go on and build other businesses, other ventures, other partnerships, that gaming will definitely be seen as being a step in the path to a better future.
I'm excited about the future because I know that we are one people. We make a stance. We're still here and we're still thriving.
I'm just so impressed by the fact that versus some other areas of America that the Kumeyaay are still here. And while the population's a little off because they're not all native San Diegans, in the last census, the Native American population finally got back to where it was in 1769.
I admire the Kumeyaay people and what a miracle it is that they've been able to survive everything they've been through and to excel and to be able to achieve the great things that they have achieved. And I see that they will achieve even greater things as they move into the future generations.
Well, our ancestors fought for what they believe in, and that's why we have all this today. So I'm very thankful for what they did, and here we are.
There's moments in my life where I think, are we as a people going to be here? Will we be here in the future? Will we have a language? These songs I sing, will they be here tomorrow? When I'm gone, will they be here? And when I see my kids sing this song, when I see them get out there and sing and dance, I have no question as to whether they'll be here tomorrow. I have no question as to whether our people will be here. I know our language, our culture, I know everything that we are as Kumeyaay will forever be here in San Diego. We've been here since the creation of human history, and I believe we'll be here until there's humans not here. We'll always be here as Kumeyaay.
Okay, I hope that came through okay. At least hope. By the way, is the video making it through clean or is it breaking up a bit?
It's choppy.
Okay. That's one of our challenges. We're hoping that our next programs might even be in person to the extent that we can actually do justice to the works that are will be presented. But I hope at least it came through enough that you could see the gist of where the producers were going with this one. So I thank you all for your inputs, and particularly we'll look and see, we'll add to the programming, looking into some of the suggestions that's been in the chat. And also, while November is being recognized as Native American Heritage Month, among other titles, our interest in building a meaningful relationship goes way beyond a month. We will certainly try to make that to be part of our mission. And you'll certainly will hear more about that as we move forward, particularly with the collaboration between Sacred Ground in Action and also Simpler Living. In the interest of time, I think, Diane, you have a closing.
I have one.
That's great.
Okay. I was just going to ask you, Robbie, do we have this link on our SGIA?
Yes, thank you. Yes, we have a few videos up to now that we've already placed. We placed them on the SGIA web presence that's found within the cathedral's web presence. And that, so the links for those YouTube videos are right there. As we come across more works, we will add them to this mix so that parties can find it and see it in a less choppy version and continuous without necessarily having it broken up as we've done here.
Robbie, could I also mention that it's in this past week's e-bulletin as well. The links are there as well. It might be a little quicker. I don't know.
Though we would like you to peruse Sacred Ground in Action and Simpler Living sites as well. So
that's true. Sorry.
We're trying to leave as much information there. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of good stuff.
Okay.
Am I echoing only to me or to you guys too?
I'm sorry, say again, please.
I said, can you, hold on a second. Am I echoing to you?
Not anymore.
Not anymore.
Okay, great.
I think the other Kathleen was
Can you hear
picking
me
up
now?
on that.
Is that better?
That's
All
good.
That's good, yeah.
I don't want to be choppy too.
You're fine.
All right, okay. Let us pray. You, Creator God, know the needs of the indigenous peoples of this place far better than we do. We are aware of the ongoing injustices and adversity, including racism, which our indigenous brothers, sisters, and cousins experience. The violence faced by some in our own community angers us, saddens us, and frustrates us, and leaves us searching for answers. Help us to use our gifts, our knowledge, our skills, our positions in society, and our strength in Christ as a community of faith to support our neighbors. Give us humility and the wisdom to know when and how to follow their lead in seeking solutions and in making positive changes. Open our hearts, our minds, and our spirits to new possibilities when the steps of our indigenous leaders and neighbors wish to take may be uncomfortable or unfamiliar. Please fill us with the power and the courage to trust in you and to trust in others. Help us to trust in the deep wisdom and the traditional knowledge that you have gifted to our indigenous neighbors. Help us to accept the gifts of learning from our neighbors that we may broaden and deepen our understanding of how to live together, to share resources, to put our complementary skills to work together, and most of all, build on our common desire to live in wholeness together as you would want all of your peoples. We ask this and we pray this in your son's name. Amen.